Okay, let's get to learn about another bone of the skull, which is the occipital bone. Remember, occipital forms part of the cranium, or is a component of the cranium. The occipital bone forms the posterior part and the most of the base of the cranium, and it articulates with the temporal sphenoid and the uppermost vertebra, which is the atlas. Its inferior portion is a thick block-like region that surrounds the junctions of the brain and the spinal cord. So that's all about occipital. That's the brief explanation. And for that, we have the occipital bone dominating this area of the skull, which is the posterior, and at least the base of the skull. And with a few surface structures, we have the superior nuchal line, external occipital protuberance. We as well have the inferior nuchal line and the foramen magnum, which is what we're going to discuss. Also, we have the occipital condyle and one lambdoidal suture, which is identified to be the point where the occipital bone meets another bone of the skull, which is the parietal. This is another architecture of the skull taken from below, and we have the occipital bone painted with blue. So this is the same as other skull bones, and we have the occipital bone dominating this area. For the surface anatomy or the surface feature of the occipital bone, we have the first one, the foramen magnum, is the inferior part of the bone. Within this foramen, the medulla oblongata connects with the spinal cord, the vertebral arteries, spinal arteries, and accessory nerve number 11 nerve also passes through this foramen. So that foramen magnum, which we shall check as well, but let's just go to the previous image and identify that foramen magnum. So this is the stuff where the neurovascular elements or those major neurovascular elements passes through. So the occipital condyles are two oval processes with convex surface, one on either side of the foramen magnum, and they articulate with depression on the first cervical vertebra, which is the atlas, to form the atlanto-occipital joints. Superior to each occipital condyle on the inferior surface of the skull is the hypoglossal canals, through which the hypoglossal, which is nerve number 12, passes through, and a branch of the ascending pharyngeal artery passes through as well. So that's about occipital, or few of them. Let's just review what we've been studying. And the part labeled 35 is the foramen magnum, of which we've been able to describe. We as well have the part labeled 28, the hypoglossal canal, where the nerve number 12 passes through. And we as well have the part labeled 38. This point is the external occipital protuberance. We have the part labeled 39. 39 is the point. 38, the squamous part of the occipital bone. Then we as well have other structures within the occipital is 33, and that is the condylar canal. We as well have part labeled 44, that is the pharyngeal tubercle. Then 45, located here, is the external occipital crest. I'll just move my pointer. Yeah, this region is known as the external occipital crest. The external occipital protuberance, for the one which we've been able, external occipital protuberance, which is 39 this point. So is the most prominent midline projection on the posterior surface of the bone, just superior to the foramen magnum. Squamous portion of the occipital bone is by far the largest, constituting the largest plate of bone, posterior and superior to the foramen magnum. Occipital planum is the part of the occipital squama that lies above the superior nuchal line. So this is much detailed. Let's just review for that what we've been learning. So we have the occipital planum, external occipital protuberance right here, superior nuchal line, nuchal planum found within this area. We also have inferior nuchal line, and then we have the external occipital crest. Remember, we have the protuberance, the superior, then the crest inferior. Foramen magnum is right there. We have the condylar foramen, which lies here. Then condylar fossa is identified there. Then we have the hypoglossal canal, then occipital condyle, and finally groove for the medulla oblongata. This is the occipital posterior inferior aspect, ectocranial, which means is the external surface of the occipital. The external occipital protuberance lies on the ectocranial midline where the occipital and the nuchal planes meet. Superior nuchal line lies on either side of the midline on the ectocranial surface of the squamous portion. Inferior nuchal line parallels superior lines but are located about midway on the ectocranial nuchal plane, and fascia separating nuchal muscles attached to this line. External occipital crest is a highly variable median line or crest that passes between the right and left nuchal musculature. It stretches from the external occipital protuberance to the rear of the foramen magnum, anchoring the nuchal ligaments. The basilar part, of which we shall be able to identify as well, is the thick square projection anterior to the foramen magnum. This part articulates to the petrous portion of the both temporals and with the sphenoid via the spheno-occipital suture. The lateral or the condylar parts of the occipital lie on either side of the foramen magnum, articulating with the temporals. So that's all about the basilar part. Then we have another feature, which is the condylar fossae, are ectocranial depressions immediately posterior to the condyles. These fossae receive the posterior margin of the superior facet of the superior facets of the atlas vertebra when the head extends backwards. So we have a little repetition here, but it's all the same description about the condylar fossa. The condylar fossa is where I've been able to identify, which is right here. So this is the occipital posterior inferior aspect, ectocranial, of which we've been able to check. So we have the condylar foramina perforates the occipital at the depth of the condylar fossa, where each transmits an emissary vein. Hypoglossal canal are tunnels through the anterior part of the base of each condyle, and this canal gives exit to the hypoglossal nerve, cranial nerve number 12, and the entrance to the arteries. I think I've been able to explain about this. It's just but a repetition. The jugular process are laterally directed corners of the bone placed lateral to the condyles. The tips of this process lie at the anterior-most point along the occipital mastoid suture. Jugular notch is excavated into the anterior surface of the jugular process, and this notch forms the posterior half of the jugular foramen in the articulated cranium, with the anterior half being contributed by the temporal bone. Moving ahead, we have the anterior endocranial occipital, and let's get to review the structures. The occipital sulcus occupies this region. We have the cerebral fossa, then we have the transverse sulcus, internal occipital crest, then cerebellar fossa. Mark the difference. Cerebral lies here, then the cerebellar, it dominates this other position. The jugular process and the jugular notch, we've been able to discuss about that. Then we have the hypoglossal canal, which is right here. And finally, the cruciform eminence, internal occipital protuberance, which dominates this area. At the description part, we have the cruciform eminence divides the endocranial surface of the occipital squama into 4 fossae. Then the cerebral fossa are the triangular depressions below the lambdoidal suture on the endocranial surface of the occipital, and they house the occipital lobes of the brain, which is the cerebrum. Cerebellar fossa occupies the inferior part of the endocranial surface of the occipital squama, and this is the region where the cerebellar lobes rest. The internal occipital protuberance lie at the center of the cruciform eminence. We've been able to check on that from the previous image. So, and we have as well other structures as the occipital sagittal sulcus passes superiorly from the internal occipital protuberance. It's a deep endocranial groove marking the posterior extension of the sagittal sinus, which is a major blood drainage from the brain. The internal occipital crest is the inferior arm of the cruciform eminence. Then let's get to the other parts. We have groove of the medulla oblongata is the hollowing in the endocrinium surface of the basilar part of the occipital bone. You're able to check on that. Then you have the transverse sulci, forms the transverse arm of the cruciform eminence. They house the transverse sinuses. The one on the right is larger and communicates directly with the sagittal sulcus. Then the transverse on the occipital connects with the sigmoid sulcus of the temporal and endocrinium jugular process, often via the transverse sulcus and the mastoid cone of the parietal. So as we will be getting along, we'll be able to identify all these definite structures found within the occipital. So that marks the end of the occipital, and then during our next discussion, we shall be able to learn about the sphenoid bone. Just a little or a brief explanation for the sphenoid. The sphenoid is the most complex bone of the cranium, and it needs much time for its discussion. So I think that will mark the end of our today's discussion, and I hope you've been able to capture something. Thank you. Love, I'm done.